Redfall is an upcoming, shooter, kind of looter shooter, light semi games of service. I really have a hard time classifying it. Maybe it's like Borderlands with vampires. I've also seen Far Cry as an example of this game. It has recently announced last week that they talked about that the game launches and they're going to have a performance. They're going to have a performance mode for 4K, and you can put that on to 4K on like an Xbox Series X or console. But the game's going to be locked at 30 frames per second on Series S and Series X, with at some point undetermined a frames per second boost mode to boost it up to 60 frames per second sometime after the game's launch. This has put obviously Twitter into a firestorm. And in this case, this is where I've honestly, from looking at all the takes on the internet last week, I feel like this has got Sony and Xbox fanboys all in unison upset that Redfall is not going to have a 60 frames per second on console at launch, thus questioning should this game be delayed just to make sure they hit the 60 frames per second. Chris, I'd love to know where you fall on this. You have a Series S. Is 60 frames a second the standard of this generation, or is 30 frames per second good enough?
I think 60 frames is required for most combat systems to feel good. I think that most of us, I don't think it's uncommon. I don't think it makes me insane to say that when I am in a boss fight or something, I would sacrifice resolution to protect frame rate any day of the week. And so to have a cap on my frame rate that makes it to where it is like, if you're sitting down and watching TV is regularly in the United States was broadcasted at 24 frames. Mm-hmm. And we're getting to where we're used to consuming our medium in much higher, but 24 was always seen as acceptable. It's linked to things like excessive eye fatigue and things like that, but ultimately we can manage. But that is not taking an active role. It does not feel good to press control and you only have, an update every half a second, and that's got to sync with you. So your information is always missing, like not half a second, but half a milli, whatever that is. Half the frames.
It's half the frame.
It's half the frames. So like it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
Should they delay Redfall until they had that? Because they've already confirmed it's on the way. So it's not that it is impossible. It just makes it feel less optimized for release, that they're trying to artificially hit this release after they delayed out of 2023. Should they delay again to hit this 60 frames per second, which the systems should be able to do?
I don't know. It depends on how long that delay is, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's still a business to run. So I know a lot of people are like, hey, you know what? Take all the time you need. Just do it right the first time. Like people say it to streamers all the time. If you need a mental health day, take a mental health day. Take care of your family. Take care of you. That's the most important thing. But they're not the ones that pay your bills.
Right.
So like you're up until recently. So you're until recently you were a contract employee, and like you could have just not taken contracts if you need to take some time for yourself. Right. But then who paid your bills? And so these game companies, like they have real salaries going out. They have real lease spaces they pay for. So I think it's really nice for people like, you know what? I just want to pay you for a good game. Why don't you just make it good and then release it to me? That's really nice. But a lot of these studios, they're in the red and they need money. And so I understand why sometimes partial products get released, because partial products generate revenue. And then ideally, based on that revenue, you can continue to project out and say, hey, we can justify to shareholders, we can justify to our accountants, we can justify continuing to invest in this game. And it's really frustrating as a gamer because it means you're buying a partial product and there's no difference on the packaging. When you go to buy a game, it is identically marketed whether it is complete or not. Mm-hmm. Because nobody in their right mind would release a product that says like, well, it's partial, like, because then we wouldn't buy it. So
no, we probably still would. You call that early access, you call that beta. We'll sell you all kinds of other ways of monetizing you in this game. So I think there's plenty of precedence for that. I feel a little really like frustrated by like the announcement, because I like when it was all the discussion was happening on Twitter last week. It was like Thursday and Friday. Like it's just like Microsoft, just another L from, I think, Microsoft in this case. They spent this money, they've acquired these studios, they had to delay, and even Chat Veritas is saying Microsoft already delayed Starfield to the second half. So they originally said Starfield is being delayed to the first half of 2023. That is no longer the case. That is being pushed to the second half. And Starfield was a big reason, a big marketing push behind them doing that. I'm still frustrated that they're only locking that down to Xbox. I think that's a mistake from their perspective. And yes, they spend the money, but if they decided to do it as a timed exclusive, I could understand that a little bit better. I think that's better overall for gamers and choice. And like you said, getting these companies out of the red and into the green. Like selling a game is still selling a game, whether you're going to be on PC, on Xbox, on PlayStation, and especially in a multiplayer aspect. That's my biggest and bigger concern, is them trying to lock this down onto the Xbox consoles, obviously PC as well, but then having an inferior product. Let's not beat around the bush. 30 frames per second, especially in this generation of 60 frames per second, and especially multiple games also pushing to 120 frames per second. We're not even talking about like hyper performance.
To be clear,
mode.
Some games don't need that. Final Fantasy 14 does not need 120 frames.
You don't need 120 frames, but 60 frames is such a better, like, the studies have shown, like when you just overall performance, like the response time, the players' enjoyment, like multiple times, like they've done studies on gamers at 30. People enjoy mentally like the 60. It just feels like
Counter-Strike is a huge difference. I watched some of the stuff on Counter-Strike and what you're describing. Like if anybody wants to go verify what Brian's saying, Counter-Strike is a game that they have studied, and there is a difference in performance, in how eye fatigue, like it's just better. 120 frames is just better. Anything you can dial the frames up is better.
Yeah. It just feels better. It just has like, it's just a better experience. And to sit here and say, hey, yep, okay, we bought the studio. Yep, it's gonna be, because like I'm gonna play it. I don't think they're gonna delay it, because we're talking May 2nd. Like that marketing, and it would be the Halo Infinite. Chris got his cans of and codes a year ahead of that, and then essentially, so I'm gonna be playing it on PC at my 60 plus frames, which PC can handle in this case. And I'm just like bummed, disappointed that console players have to wait, and that at some point that 60 frames is coming in later. And it just makes me go, what is going on? What is wrong over within the house of Microsoft, and why are they continuing to struggle? Because that is what feeds the narrative. And when you look at, especially as we bring up Halo, a big disappointment, especially more, I think, for you than me, when it comes to Halo Infinite. Like one of the things when you start looking into how Microsoft runs its shops, they have this company policy of like 18-month contractual employee, then reapply, or like the process. And so you end up having these rotating doors, and games. I don't know any AAA game that's out the door from concept to finish in 18 months. So immediately you're always having to retrain a lot of employees, which you're already doing anyway, is an HR nightmare, So it's like, when it comes down to it, like I think, and I hope that, that whatever's going wrong within the Xbox ecosystem, because that's what this feels like to me. Redfall, 60 frames, not hitting it on especially on a Series X, but Series S and Series X should and have been confirmed that they will get to that point. Missing this on that is just more fuel for the narrative that there's something wrong in the Xbox ecosystem. And I don't know what happens. And then that just drives in more fear to the Activision Blizzard acquisition. Like all of a sudden we can't hit 60 frames a second on PlayStation. Like that's something that I know the Sony side has presented, that they'd have an inferior version of that. And that's now that argument has more validity, even if it isn't necessarily true. What do you think, Chris?
The problem is everything you're talking about here is speculation. And once speculation gets out there, there's no removing it.
Yeah, you have to fight hard against it.
I can play New World for 2 hours on Twitch before somebody comes in and says, isn't this game terrible? And when you ask them for examples, they talk about item dupes, they talk about gold exploits, they talk about things that have not been in the game for 18 months or more. And they're like, well, yeah, but wouldn't it crash the economy forever? No, you can only have 500,000 gold on you. So even if somebody exploited to cap that money would be gone by now. The average
Well,
in-game player I talk about that crafts is burning through 100,000 gold, 200,000 gold every week to 4 weeks, depending on how aggressively they play. So like that would just work itself out of their economy, because
they also pulled 99.8% like of that gold that was duped the month, like in that same month that it happened. They have like all the logs, so they were able to see all that happen, and then they rolled it back. It was an unfortunate thing, because you're right, that becomes the thing you have to fight against. That's the narrative that gets set in the back of people's minds, and everybody's busy, right? Like, because not everybody's like actively focusing on one issue. You're like, oh, I was playing this game. Wait a minute, I remember this being a headline that obviously gets eyeballs, but you don't ever really see the correction or the action that's taken against it. And then it falls on content creators to be like, well, I guess we're going to be answering that question for the next 2 or 3 years at a minimum.
Yeah, because back in the day of the newspaper, the correction was issued as a 2-sentence statement on page 11B. And like the initial thing came with a big, condemning photo. It had your face on it, had a headline. Like, it was so bad, and it was page 1. So like, it's just so hard to deal with those retractions. And it's the same in gaming. Like, once perception's out there, so like the biggest thing you talk about there is perception. It doesn't even matter if what you're saying is true.
Yeah.
Like, that's the worst part, is it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be true.